last king of England from 1216 until his death in 1272. Henry was made king when he was only 9 in the middle of the First Barons' War. King John died while Henry and his mother were at Corfe Castle in Dorset. To help Henry reclaim the kingdom, John appointed a council of 13 executors, and he requested that his son be placed under the care of William Marshal, one of England's most famous knights. In 2070, Henry became increasingly ill. Though he recovered slightly, his health never fully returned. On the 16th of November 1272, Henry died. He had a magnificent funeral, and his body was temporarily buried in Edward the Confessor's grave in the Abbey. He was the first monarch to be buried in a coffin, rather than the body being visible on a bier. He was buried 19 years later in the magnificent tomb that Edward I built to the north of St Edward's Shrine. Although his heart was taken to the abbey at Fontevraud in France, as Henry had wished, there is still decoration on the north side of Henry's tomb, despite much of it being robbed. There is a possibility that the arched recesses on the chapel side once contained relics of a saint's, as well as the small cavity in the pillar near the head of the effigy. There is a magnificent gilt bronze effigy on top of the tomb. The back of the effigy has been hollowed out just to make it lighter. On the metal plate on which the king lies, the pillows beneath his head as well as on his shoes are the lions of England, as well as the gems from his crown and robe and the sceptres he held. The arched canopy behind his head has disappeared. Also gone are the 2 lions at his feet. The wooden canopy over the tomb dates from the 15th century and was once painted and gilt, but has lost its grille that protected it. In 1327, Edward became King of England and died in 1377. The military success he achieved and the restoration of royal authority following his father's unorthodox reign made him a notable figure in history. England was transformed into one of the most formidable military powers in Europe by Edward III. The period of his reign was the second longest in medieval English history. He witnessed important developments in legislation and government, such as the development of the English Parliament as well as the effects of the Black Death. Around the 29th of September 1376, he fell ill with a large abscess. After a brief period of recovery in February 1377, the king died of a stroke at Sheen on the 21st of June. He was succeeded by his 10-year-old grandson, King Richard II. Richard was just 10 years old when he was crowned King of England in 1377 and remained king until he was removed in 1399. Richard's death is surrounded by rumour and speculation. It seems he died and was buried twice, so let's investigate the 2 bodies of Richard II. Henry had agreed to let Richard live after his abdication. This all changed when it was revealed that the Earls of Huntingdon, Kent and Salisbury and Lord Despencer and possibly also the Earl of Rutland were planning to murder the new king, Henry IV, and restore Richard in the Epiphany Rising. This plot highlighted the danger of allowing Richard to live. Richard died at Pontefract Castle on or around the 14th of February 1400. It is thought he was starved to death. However, rumours spread that he was actually murdered, so his body was brought for public view to St Paul's Cathedral in London and then buried at Friary in Langley, Hertfordshire. When Henry V came to the throne, in an effort both to atone for his father's act of murder, he ordered the removal of the body to Westminster Abbey in 1413 to join Anne in the tomb Richard had erected for them in the chapel of St Edward's the Confessor, next to that of Edward III. The bodies lie in the tomb chest below the effigies. Or do they? So just after Richard's death, rumours surfaced that Richard was actually still alive. It was in Scotland that a man named Richard came into the hands of Regent Albany, lodging in Stirling Castle, and he served as the national figurehead of various anti-Lancasterians and Lollard intrigues in England. In 1419, Henry IV's government dismissed him as an impostor, and several sources, both north and south of the border, suggest the man suffered from mental illness. He was mentioned as a beggar by the time of his death, but nonetheless he was buried as a king in the local Dominican friary in Stirling. Anne's tomb was opened in 1871, but most of her skeleton was missing, as bones were removed over the years by the visitors through a hole in the side of the base of the tomb where shields has once been attached. However, Richard's body was still intact. Henry of Monmouth was King of England from 1413 until his death in 1422. Henry is known and celebrated as one of the greatest warrior kings of medieval England. His victory at the Battle of Agincourt made history as his army was significantly smaller than France's. Shakespeare wrote a play on Henry and his battle. This included his St Crispin's Day speech. On the eve of the Battle of Agincourt, which fell on St Crispin's Day, Henry V urged his men, who were vastly outnumbered by the French, to imagine their glory and immortality that would be theirs if they were victorious. Henry V died on the 31st of August 1422. He had been weakened by battlefield dysentery. It is believed that the last day he was active, he had been riding in full armour in blistering heat and may have been suffering from heat stroke. After Henry's death in France, his body was brought back to England and bore the royal standard at his funeral. Henry V was buried in Westminster Abbey on the 7th of November 1422. Now, when Anne married Edward of Westminster, she became Princess of Wales, and then Queen of England when she married King Richard III. During the War of the Roses, Anne played a critical role in the battle between the Houses of York and the House of Lancaster for the crown of England. Anne Neville died on the 16th of March 1485, and the probable cause is thought to be tuberculosis. She was buried at Westminster Abbey in an unmarked grave to the right of the high altar, next to the door to the Confessor's Chapel. The funeral was attended by King Richard III, who was reportedly so bereft and wept. There were, however, rumours that Richard III had poisoned her in order to marry his niece, Elizabeth of York. There was no memorial to Queen Anne until 1960, when a bronze tablet was erected on a wall near her grave by the Richard III Society. Henry VII was King of England from the 22nd of August 1485 until his death in 1509. Henry married Elizabeth of York in December 1483 and was noted to be affectionate to his wife and all his children. Year 1502 was challenging and personal year for Henry VII, as many of the people close to him died within that year. His first son and heir, Arthur, Prince of Wales, died suddenly from a viral respiratory illness. Henry surprised his courtiers by showing intense grief and sobbing at his son's death, for Henry was usually a reserved man. The following year his wife Queen Elizabeth died, which led King Henry to shut himself away for several days and refuse to speak to anybody. During this time Henry became sick and nearly died himself. In 1509 Henry VII died of tuberculosis at Richmond Palace and was buried in the chapel he commissioned in Westminster Abbey next to his wife Elizabeth. So next up we have Anne of Cleves. From the 6th of January to the 9th of July 1540, Anne was married to King Henry VIII. She was his fourth wife. Henry and Anne were married on the 6th of January 1540, but their marriage was declared unconsummated after 6 months, and it was annulled. Following this annulment, Henry generously compensated her, and she became known as the King's beloved sister. Anne outlived all Henry's wives, and she died at the Chelsea Old Manor on 16th of July 1557. Most likely she died of cancer. She was buried at Westminster Abbey on the 3rd of August. In the Abbey, her impressive funeral was conducted according to Catholic rites, as Anne has requested. Her tomb has been described as hard to find. It is adjacent to Edward the Confessor's shrine, and it does look as though her other tombs have been built around it, and it only leaves her inscription visible. Mary Queen of Scots was born in 1542, daughter of King James V of Scotland and Mary of Guise. Her father died just a week after her birth. Mary's life was complicated. After a long fight over the throne, abdications and imprisonments, Mary was put on trial for the treason under the Act for the Queen's safety before a court of 36 noblemen. On 25th of October 1586, Mary was sentenced to death. Despite pressures from the English Parliament, Elizabeth was hesitating to carry out the sentence. She feared that she was setting a discreditable precedent by killing a queen, particularly if Mary's son, James, formed an alliance with the Catholic powers and invaded England. On the 1st of February 1587, Elizabeth signed the death warrant and entrusted it to William Davison, a Privy Councillor. Cecil summoned 10 members of the Privy Council without Elizabeth's knowledge on the 3rd of February, and they conducted the execution immediately after being summoned. Mary was told that she was to be executed the next morning at Fotheringay on the evening of the 7th of February 1587. The Queen spent her last few hours in prayer, distributing her belongings to her household and writing letters to the King of France. The scaffold in the Great Hall was covered in a black cloth. 2 or 3 steps led to the platform, which was furnished with 3 stalls for her and the Earls of Shrewsbury and Kent, who were there to witness her execution. As is customary, both the bull and his assistant knelt before her to sought forgiveness, as it is custom for the executioner to look for forgiveness from the one he is executing. Mary replied, "I forgive you with all my heart for now. I hope you shall make an end of all my troubles." She was helped to remove her outer dress by servants Jane Kennedy and Elizabeth Curl, and the executioners. She was wearing a velvet underskirt and a pair of crimson brown sleeves with a black satin bodice. As she disrobed, Mary smiled and said she had never had such grooms before, nor ever put off her clothes before such a company. Kennedy bound her with a blindfold, with a white veil embroidered with gold, placed her head on a block, and asked her to stretch her arms out. Her last words were, "In manus tueus domine commendo spiritum meum," which means, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." Mary, unfortunately, was not beheaded with a single blow. It was quite a gruesome execution. The first blow struck the back of her head and missed her neck. The second blow severed the neck except for a small amount of sinew that the executioner had to cut through with an axe. Afterwards he held her head aloft and declared, "God save the Queen." However, the auburn hair in his hands turned out to be a wig, and the head fell to the ground, revealing Mary's very short grey hair. Cecil's nephew, who was present at the execution, reported to his uncle that after her death, her lips stirred up and down a quarter of an hour after her head was cut off. Contemporary accounts state that everything that was touched by her blood, including all her clothing, was burnt in the fireplace in the great hall to hinder relic hunters. Before her death, Mary asked Elizabeth to bury her in France, but this was denied. Her body was embalmed and kept in a lead coffin until her burial in a Protestant ceremony at Peterborough Castle in July 1587. During the embalming process, her entrails were removed and buried secretly within Fotheringay Castle. Her body was exhumed in 1612 when her son, King James VI, ordered that she be reinterred in Westminster Abbey, in the chapel opposite the tomb of Elizabeth. In 1867 her tomb was opened in an attempt to ascertain the resting place of her son, James I of England. He was ultimately found with Henry VII. Many of her other descendants, including Elizabeth of Bohemia, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, and the children of Anne, Queen of Great Britain, were interred in her vault. Elizabeth was the daughter of King Henry VIII by Anne Boleyn. From the 17th of November 1558 until her death in 1603, she was the Queen of England and Ireland. Elizabeth I was the last monarch of the Tudor house, and was sometimes referred to as the Virgin Queen. After several of her friends died in the autumn of 1602, the Queen fell into deep depression. Elizabeth fell ill in March 1603 and remained in a settled but irreversible state of melancholy. She was sitting motionless on a cushion for hours on end. Her death occurred between 2 and 4 in the morning on the 24th of March 1603. Elizabeth's coffin was carried down the river at night to Whitehall on a barge that was lit with torches. At her funeral on the 28th of April, the coffin was taken to Westminster Abbey on a hearse drawn by 4 horses hung with black velvet. Elizabeth was interred at Westminster Abbey in a tomb that she now shares with her half-sister, Mary I. James was the King of Scotland and known as James VI. He was the Scottish king from 1567 to 1625. In England, he was the first Stuart king from 1603 to 1625. The king was often seriously ill during the last years of his life. James was a heavy drinker and had lost many of his teeth. He began to suffer increasingly from arthritis, gout and kidney stones. James described his urine to his physician as being dark red colour of Alicante wine. In early 1625, James was plagued by severe attacks of arthritis, gout and fainting fits, and he fell seriously ill in March with malaria, and then he suffered a stroke. He died at Theobald's house on the 27th of March during a violent attack of dysentery. James was widely mourned. For all his flaws, he had largely retained the affection of his people, who had enjoyed uninterrupted peace and comparatively low taxation during the Jacobean era. James's funeral was on the 7th of May and was magnificent but a disorderly affair. James was buried in Westminster Abbey. The position of his tomb was lost for many years until his lead coffin was found in the Henry VII vault during an excavation in the 19th century. Following the defeat of King Charles I in the Civil War, Oliver Cromwell became Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England, Scotland and Ireland. On Charles I's death warrant, he was one of the main signatories. Cromwell led the Commonwealth of England after King Charles I was executed. The parliamentary army was a very important part of Cromwell's life and he had great political influence. By 1650, Cromwell was appointed to Lord General, effectively Commander-in-Chief of the Parliamentary Armed Forces. In December 1653, Cromwell became Lord Protector, a role in which he remained until his death 5 years later. In 1658, Cromwell was struck down with a urinary infection after the aftermath of malarial fever, leading to his death on Friday, 3rd of September, at the age of 59. It is thought that Cromwell's death was partly due to grief as well, following the death of his supposed favourite daughter Elizabeth in the previous month. It is thought that she died of cancer. Cromwell was believed to have suffered from kidney stones or a similar condition affecting his kidneys and urinary system, and his death was caused by septicemia brought on by the infection. He was buried at Westminster Abbey. Strangely though, he was dug up on the 30th of January 1661 along with that of John Bradshaw, President of the High Court of Justice for the trial of King Charles I and Henry Ireton. Cromwell's son-in-law and general in the parliamentary army during the Civil War were removed from Westminster Abbey to be posthumously tried for treason and executed. Chained to the Tyburn gallows, the dead bodies were beheaded at sunset. They were then thrown into a common grave, and the heads were displayed on the 20-foot spike at Westminster Hall, where they remained until 1685, when a storm broke the spike, tossing the heads to the ground below. Cromwell's own head was found by a soldier who hid it in his chimney. His daughter received the relic as a gift from her father on his deathbed. It was first displayed in 1710 at a freak show described as the monster's head. After passing through numerous hands, the head increased in value with every transaction until it was bought by a Dr. Wilkinson. In 1960, the Wilkinson family offered the head to his alma mater, Sydney Sussex College. It was buried secretly on the grounds of the college in a dignified manner. Mary II was Queen of England, Scotland and Ireland, co-reigning with her husband William III and II from 1689 until her death in 1694. Throughout her reign she proved a firm ruler. She even ordered the arrest of her own uncle, Henry Hyde, 2nd Earl of Clarendon, for plotting to restore James II to the throne. Many thought Mary would outlive her husband and sister, as both of them suffered from ill health. In late 1694, however, she contracted smallpox. Mary felt better after her smallpox lesions disappeared several days into her illness. Her skin was smooth and again unmarked. In the beginning, her attendants thought she may have suffered measles rather than smallpox, and that she was actually recovering. But, unbeknown to her attendants, Mary was suffering from a typical fatal form of smallpox, and her condition quickly deteriorated as the rash had turned inwards. Mary died shortly after midnight on the 28th of December, at the young age of just 32. William was devastated by her death, although the Jacobites considered her death divine retribution for breaking the fifth commandment. She was widely mourned in Britain. Her embalmed body lay in state in the banqueting house in Whitehall, and on the 5th of March she was buried at Westminster Abbey. A monument to her memory was designed but never erected, probably due to the lack of space in the chapel, so this small stone is the only thing that marks her grave. As we have just seen, William ruled Britain alongside his wife and cousin, Queen Mary II. William's legacy was to contain France when it was in a position to impose its will across much of Europe. William fell from his horse Sorrel in 1702 and broke his collarbone. As a complication of this, William contracted pneumonia and died. He was buried next to his wife in Westminster Abbey, again with just a small marker to mark his grave. The Scots crowned Charles II on the 1st of January 1651. Charles invaded England, but this ended in defeat at Worcester. He fled for France for many years during the Puritan Commonwealth, but then he was restored to the throne in 1660. On the morning of the 2nd of February 1685, Charles suffered a sudden epileptic fit. 4 days later, at the Palace of Whitehall, Charles died, aged 54, at 11:45 a.m. Due to how suddenly he fell ill and died, there were rumours that he was poisoned. A more modern medical analysis has held that the symptoms of his final illness were probably due to kidney function. His coffin lay in state at Westminster before burial in the Abbey on the 14th of February 1685. Again, the only marking of his grave is a small inscription on the floor of the chapel. Edward V of England and Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, were supposedly murdered in England in the 1480s. These two brothers were the only sons of King Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, surviving at the time of their father's death in 1483. When they were just 12 and 9 years old, their uncle Richard III placed them in the Tower of London for their own protection, and they were never seen again. It was rumoured that Richard had the brothers murdered so he could become king. There are reports of the two princes seen playing in the Tower grounds in the summer of 1483, but there are no recorded sightings of either of them after them. Their fate remains a mystery. There is a strong consensus that Richard III is likely to have been involved in the disappearance of the princes. The way in which Richard had achieved the crown had left him vulnerable, leading to a backlash against him by the Yorkist establishment. There was already an attempt to rescue the princes and restore Edward to the throne, clear evidence that the princes remained a threat whilst they were still alive. By late 1483, rumours of their death were circulating, but Richard never established their existence by having them appear in public, which strongly suggests they were already dead. It would have been in Richard's best interest to open an investigation into the matter if he had not been responsible for his nephew's deaths. A wooden box with two small human skeletons were dug up from underneath the staircase in the Tower of London during a workman's excavation in 1674. At the time, it was widely accepted that the bones belonged to the princes, but this has not been proven, nor is entirely certain. The bones were placed in an urn at Westminster Abbey by King Charles II. However, some researchers now claim that King Richard III may have been innocent of the murders of his two royal nephews. Now historians have found evidence that Edward survived and lived under a false name in a rural Devon village. An effigy of a mysterious man named John Evans was found in a remote church alongside Yorkist carvings. Experts have now argued that the two men are one and the same, in the stained glass window depicting Edward V. A number of people now believe that Edward was sent to live out his days on his half-brother's land as long as he remained quiet, as part of a deal agreed by his mother and Richard III, and then later with Henry Tudor. What do you think? Leave me your messages in the comment section below. Princess Sofia was the ninth and youngest child of King James I and Anne Oldenburg, Princess of Denmark. She died the following day. She was one of 5 royal siblings to die at or shortly after birth. She was interred here at Innocents' Corner at Westminster Abbey. Her monument was that of her in her crib. Mary's tomb depicts her reclining on her left arm upon a cushion wearing a stomacher, Medici collar and French cap. Her feet are resting on a lion. The base is adorned with seated cherubs, lion masks, fruit and ribbon decorations, and a lozenge of arms. The inscription can be translated as this: Mary, daughter of James, King of Great Britain, France and Ireland, and Queen of Anne, received into heaven in earliest infancy. I found joy for myself and left grief to my parents. 16th of December, 1607. Those who wish joy ask sympathy. She lived 2 years, 5 months, 8 days. The date of death is apparently an error, as it does appear in history that she died in September. King James I also had another child, Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales. He was the eldest son. He died suddenly in 1612 and is buried in a vault in the south aisle of Henry VII's Lady Chapel in an unmarked grave.